chaos in the region that we want to handle and make it right. And here today, I'm so glad that I represent 22 chairs. I gave you the paper of different NATO member countries, different parliaments, and Ukrainian parliament, who agree with us that this is time to end it. This is time to fully implement Bucharest, to start moving on the path to membership. And, here we are the result of those wise policies. We have our friend Michael, actually Danish Liberal Party, whose leader, Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, was the one, together with other American leaders, from the very beginning to say it loud and clear: Baltics are part of our family. And when you said it in Copenhagen European Council in '93, and on different other occasions in NATO, we had Russian troops leaving our territories. We have, we transformed our economies beyond recognition. We are 92% of EU average today. Our trajectory of growth is like this. So look to us like a shining example of your good policies and compare it with policies from Bucharest. So we hope that Biden administration has a chance to follow all good tracks to create that success in Ukraine. This is the window of opportunity that is open in diplomacy, usually for a short period of time. I was serving here in the Obama administration that was using reset policy to Russia. It failed. So now it's time to learn from our mistakes and make it right. Make it Baltic way, make it Central European way, because that's the only way we have. And finally create Europe whole and free that a lot of American presidents dreamed of, and even give a little chance for Russians to transform. I think this is controversial, but worth to be mentioned.
Well, let's go to neighboring Estonia and welcome Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for joining us. Your ambassador is here to supervise what you have to say, so curious to hear what the Estonian point of view is on how things are progressing in the lead up to the summit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us here at Hudson. Always good to have interesting conversations in Washington. We're just launching our 2 days trip here and looking forward to have a very good and interesting and very important exchanges with our colleagues on the Hill. But I am pretty optimistic, taking into account the timeline we have seen since perhaps, if you mentioned already 2008, then think where we were as alliance in 2008. We have as Baltic states, we didn't even have a defense plans that time adopted. We didn't have allied presence on the eastern flank, and while we debated about to give a membership action plan to Georgia or Ukraine at Bucharest, we didn't, as an alliance, realize that we are at the brink of war, which Russia launched just a few months after failure of alliance to agree upon a map for Georgia and Ukraine. In August 2008, Russia launched the war against Georgia, occupied 1/5 of Georgian territory, and hoped that with that move, NATO will never enlarge into South Caucasus. And also I agree with Žygimantas that even after this, what Putin said in 2007 in Munich and what they did in real terms, starting conventional war against neighboring nation, Georgia, we didn't that time yet as an alliance recognize the growing threat to us. Only it took Russia to start the war against Ukraine in 2014, occupying and annexing illegally Crimea and starting the war against Ukraine. That time, the alliance started to move on and creating a presence, a military presence, allied presence on the eastern flank. And the United States that time was the leading force to react quickly and swiftly on changing situation. But then it comes to year 2023 and the upcoming Vilnius summit, then I don't think that we have in our alliance today any doubt that we have to bolster our deterrence, our allied deterrence against the most existential threat what the alliance has. And Russia still have for years to come possibility, intent, and perhaps even readiness to probe is our alliance rock solid behind of Article 5 commitment or not. And this is why this summit, upcoming summit, is crucial to signaling to Russians that we are together, we are strongly united, we are not only strong in our words, when we say that every inch of NATO's territory is protected and defended, but we also show in action that this is to be taken seriously. So, and last but not least, obviously, extremely important signal what leaders of NATO should give out is that there should be agreed upon very specific wording and also message for Ukraine, because in terms of their membership in NATO, we have to move on from what we agreed upon already in 2008. We have to give a path to Ukraine for them to understand what and when and how they can be accepted as a full members of NATO, because we recognize that only when we are all interested to restore peace and stability in Europe, then it takes us to support Ukraine winning this war and bringing Ukraine to NATO. That will make sure that the deterrence against possible existential threat, which will still exist even after Ukrainian win in this war, we stand as alliance strongly together. And lastly, of course, we hope that at Vilnius, Sweden will be also accepted as a 32nd member of NATO.
Well, that's a very nice transition towards our Nordic colleagues. But before I do that, I would just say it's refreshing to have Baltic state leadership here, because you're always so clear in your words, but also back that with financial commitments. I noticed recently that Estonian purchases or orders for artillery, if it were converted to American sums, would run in the high hundreds of billions of dollars. I got that from your Twitter feed from last week.
Yeah, it's more than 700 billion in comparison to that what we will spend in Estonia. But also, it is perhaps to just to highlight this as well, that we have to take politically very seriously also our commitments, what we agreed upon years ago about level of defense expenditure, what we need to invest in Estonia and in other Baltic countries today. Politically, very strong and clear commitment that actually the defense expenditure should run around level of 3%, and we really hope that our allies will recognize that 2% is not the ceiling but a floor, and we would like to see that we are moving towards consensus on 2.5% in the alliance.
And of course, Lithuania also ranks at or near the top as a percentage of GDP in assistance to Ukraine. Denmark, the Kingdom of Denmark, is represented today by Michael Astrup Jensen. Thank you for being here. You too made headlines in recent months, emptying out your Caesar self-propelled howitzers, 155 millimeter shells, I think sending all 19 of them to the Ukrainians. That was announced, I think, perhaps in January or around then. How do you see the run-up to the summit? And while all the talk is about the fate of Ukraine and its potential, your colleagues already mentioned it, this would be the first time in modern history that all the Nordic states are part of one military alliance. What are the rumblings in Copenhagen about Sweden's prospects?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate here as well. You know, it has been completely wake-up call for us in Copenhagen regarding the invasion last February in many ways. And let me touch upon a few of them. First of all, the defense of our kingdom. Before the invasion, we were approximately spending 1.35% of our GDP on defense. This year, we will reach 2%. So, you know, in a very short amount of time, we have reached the floor because we are fully agreeing that this should be the floor. It's not the ceiling. So if NATO alliance agree on a point, I don't know, 2.5 or 3.0 or whatever, we have already also stated that we will also reach that as soon as possible, because it is important now that we take this serious. The defense of our kingdom is also threatened. We see Russian build-up military bases in the Arctic that are threatening our territory of Greenland. We see Russian fighter planes flying over the Faroe Islands. Therefore, we also need to expand the defense on the Faroe Island up in the North Atlantic, and of course also regarding the Baltic Sea. Denmark lies very strategic, meaning that all Russians Navy has to sail through our waters if they come out from St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. And therefore, we also need to beef up our defense in that amount. And that is, you know, a completely new awakening for us. It shouldn't be, but it is. Because, you know, my Baltic friends have for so many years tried to raise it and say, you know, look upon Russia. And I must admit that perhaps some of your friends have been a little bit sleeping. But now we have awakened, and now we're trying to catch up. And one of the areas that I'm really glad that we are catching up is that we have a unified Nordic approach, hopefully in NATO as well. We welcome Finland, of course, and now we hope that we also welcome Sweden. And what I'm hearing is that after the Turkish election, which we could talk a lot about, but we shouldn't, hopefully there will also be some kind of white smoke coming out of Ankara, meaning that we can hopefully finalize Sweden's accession into NATO, because there are no problems whatsoever. Sweden are expanding their military as well. They have said they will reach the 2.0 threshold as well. They are a very good partner already, and therefore we'll need Sweden inside NATO as soon as possible. They are also EU member, of course, so therefore I really hope so. And we are trying to push as much as we can for our Swedish friends to be a member of NATO. And regarding Ukraine in general, you know, you mentioned that we sent out all our Caesars artillery pieces. That's right. We're also part of the tank coalition, meaning the Leopard 1 and Leopard 2 tanks that were supplied to Ukraine. We were part of that. We have also been pushing the Biden administration regarding the F-16s, and thankfully, Biden administration just a couple of weeks ago said yes, so that we can now start training. We are going to get supplies of F-35s this autumn to Denmark, and therefore we have F-16s in surplus. And it is my intention, and I think with broad support in Parliament, that we also hope that we can both start up training of F-16s and thereafter supply F-16s to Ukraine. You know, the Ukrainians have so much courage that is, you know, really, really heartwarming. But they need air power. They need air power so that they can attack drones. They have lots and lots of anti-air missiles and so on, and that's good, but they need air power. And therefore, the next step is F-16s, and we are trying to push that, for example, with our Dutch friends, who are also in that regard. And let me say something, because I know in America, you are a very divided country on many issues. You know what? In Denmark, we are also quite divided. We have 12 parties in parliament. That is not something you should strive for, because 12 parties in parliament, that's a lot. But regarding Ukraine, we are completely unified. Completely unified. From the old Communist Party on the left over to the very right-wing populist parties as well. All 12 parties have supported all the donations we are given to Ukraine, have supported whatever we are doing about Ukraine. My committee has to be consulted every time we do a donation to Ukraine by the government, and every time we're completely unified in our committee. It's my first time. I've been a member of parliament for 18 years. I've never tried that before. So that is also to try to send a very clear signal to our American friends that this is not politics. This is much, much above politics. This is about the security of Europe and therefore also the security of the Western world. And that's why we need our American friends to also be unified about Ukraine's path for NATO. Because let's be frank, if the wording and the path for Ukrainian membership to NATO is not clear in Vilnius, who will win the most? It will be Putin and the Russians. They will use it for a propaganda victory, which none of us gain anything about. So that's why we're really over here and trying to send a very clear signal that Europe are unified, and therefore we also hope that America will follow. Thank you.
Just a drop, when I'm listening to you, Michael, I think we will actually do it, because when Danes had started a crusade on Baltic membership or Lithuanian, they were quite alone. We had few senators on the Hill, including Senator Biden, late Senator McCain, but you did it. So we will do it for Ukraine. And just one thing that I also wanted to mention that was not mentioned during our initial statement, it's Indo-Pacific. Another person who will drink a lot of champagne, I don't know whether he's drinking champagne, will be Xi. He's carefully watching what's happening here. He has unlimited partnership with Russia, not only him, some other evil states around. But if we fail in Vilnius, I don't know how much it will take for him to make a mistake in Indo-Pacific that will have a colossal impact on world economy, including American one, because while we've been screaming and shouting as Baltics, please detach, decouple from Russian economy, but unfortunately, all those Western democracies are so much attached to Chinese economy that will have a huge impact. So if you want to save rules-based order, you have to win in Ukraine, and you have to seal that victory in NATO, like you did with Baltics. And I remember Dan Fried speaking, Marco, at Leonard Merrick conference recently. Dan Fried was sitting in such a panel, and he said, guys, I heard all those arguments against Ukrainian membership in NATO when I was lobbying the Baltic or Central European. And you know what? If we wouldn't be then making right decision today, we would fight not for Kiev, but for Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius. And he is right. So, let's do the same what we did during the times of Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, Dan Fried, and other great strategists, Bill Clinton, all those great presidents who wanted to consolidate our values, to defend them, because for 15, 16, 17 years, democracy is dying on a global scale, and that's our responsibility.
It's clear that the Ukrainians won't accept, or that they would be hugely disappointed and send that negative signal you're describing if the same rote, ritualized language of the Bucharest summit is just repeated in the declaration that ends the summit in Vilnius. So they will want more than that. And weapons alone, for example, much is talked about an Israel-style security package for the Ukrainians that extends over several years won't be sufficient. But having said that, in addition to the specific language about Ukraine's future, There are, I think, a lot of creative ways to help Ukraine feel positive about this summit. My colleague Luke Coffey, and I would recommend this to everyone watching, recently published a piece, 7 Ways to Deepen NATO-Ukraine Relations at the Vilnius Summit. And he comes up with some interesting ideas, like a NATO-certified center of excellence on modern warfare, for example, with Ukraine, or perhaps a second summit declaration focused on fostering NATO-Ukraine relations and Ukraine's path to membership. Clearly, while Ukraine is at war, they're not going to be joining the alliance, but the prospects need to be there. Perhaps we could just go down the line. Are there any, beyond the specific message of getting Ukraine in the alliance, ideas or things that you would pick up as important that might help the Ukrainians feel positive about this summit? Or perhaps we'll just start at the end and come this way.
Well, one of the things that are quite important, that is to contrary to public opinion right now that Ukraine has already won the war. They haven't. They still need the supplies. They still need the arms shipments, that they still need the economic funding and so on. And therefore, we still always need to have that in pipeline as well. Mm-hmm. And I know, for example, here in the US, you have been very generous. But also, you also have to have things in your pipeline as well, as we are. You know, we're looking into the F-16s, for example, as I mentioned. And if the funding for the Ukrainian wars dry up, for example, the artillery ammunition, which they are in dire need of. Therefore, thankfully, my committee worked, even though I was here yesterday, or this morning, sorry, and said yes to a new shipment of artillery ammunition. So they're not drying up on that. Because if they don't get the necessary ammunition, their tanks, their artillery pieces, and so on, they will stop, of course, their advancement. And therefore, we also need to have strong wording about the path, but also strong wording about the necessary arms shipments.
Stay with you and ask about the work of a former Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's put out, together with some Ukrainian support, a security compact, as he called it, which he's been shopping around the West. Could you talk a little bit about that and to what extent that might be an acceptable framework?
Of course, and he's also my former party chair. So there are a lot of former party chairs doing a lot of good works. So, of course, he has some excellent points. But I must admit that it is necessary to also try to step up the pacing. Because, you know, I hosted the Ukrainian number 2, which is the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, in Copenhagen, I think 3 weeks ago. And I had a very, very long meeting, 2 hours, I think it was. And he stated again and again and again that, you know, we're in it for the win, but we're in it on the long term. And this is not going to be over in half a year or 1 year. This probably will take a number of years. And therefore, we still to, of course, push for the diplomatic approach. And one of the things that is necessary that we stand unified upon is also how the end result will be. Because let's also be frank, even though I'm a politician, and that is, you know, if it gets into some kind of stabilizing frozen conflict, I hope not. I will fight it. But if it does, then we will still need a solution regarding the war crimes that have taken place in Ukraine. I visited Kiev, I think a month ago or something like that. And I've also, you know, heard the very, very extremely troubling stories about the massacres on civilians. And I saw some of it, you know, the destructions in my own eyes. So we need the war crimes tribunal, and we need a unified approach on that as well. And that is from some of the things that have been discussed right now. So in general, I support my former party chair's view, but I also think it is important to say, I don't think it'll get an end result this month or next year. This will take time.
Although in his defense, I will say he's been a long champion of Ukraine and has spoken from the stage, at least on one occasion, which we at Hudson were grateful for. Ziggy, what do you expect sort of concretely might be an option at the summit?
I still want to reject a bit or object to this thinking that we might not have Ukraine as NATO member until war is happening. When you say like this is exactly what Russians want. They created that conflict, and not only this conflict, they occupied Georgia, they created those invasions exactly not to allow EU and NATO to expand. You have to get rid of that thinking and look to the history. Okay, Copenhagen European Council, 93, July, they made a decision that free trade with the Baltics will lead to association and finally to membership. It took 2 months for Russian troops to leave Lithuania because you give the signal, this is the red line. Russians, we have an end game strategy. You do what you want. You kill, whatever number of people, we have an end game. If we just appease Russians in Vilnius just with different cosmetics, different little councils, different little slogans, they will read between the line. And we Baltics are very good in reading Russian mind. We've been living with them for 1,000 years. They're reading between the lines. The West is giving up Ukraine. They have no clue what to do with Ukrainians. We will turn it into another hell, into another Afghanistan to them. We will, we are quite good with war attrition. We have a lot of stupid Soviet weaponry. We can kill millions. They cannot. So democracies cannot make long wars. It's not sustainable. Americans have elections, and Europeans also have elections. So we will win it, like we won the Second World War. So and it will be finished. Yes, 2 or 3 millions will die, but we will recapture 20, 30 millions and huge territory. And then we will proceed with NATO, and we will kick Americans out from Europe, and Chinese will do the rest with the rest of the world, and we will live in all great Chinese-Russian concentration camp. So if you want to stop it, you have to make it very clear. You are starting the path to membership, and all those nice little details, they are just preparing for invitation, maybe at Washington NATO summit. For, this is the last window of opportunity, because then you really go to elections and nobody can say what might happen in America afterwards.
I do think that, at least here at Hudson, we tend to think of these NATO summits as an opening act in Madrid, Vilnius very important next, and then next year President Biden's already invited the heads of government to celebrate 75 years of NATO here in Washington. That is, I think, also setting aside the election calendar and election schedule, a almost thematic 3-part act, I would say, that kind of fits together. Marco?
Yes, I think what is important also during a Vilnius summit to signal out is that we are all together in understanding that this is a kind of crucial fight for freedom, not only for Ukraine, but for all of us. Because we have to also remember that then Russians gave us ultimatums in December 2021. There was nothing about Ukraine. That everything was about NATO and our common security architecture, not only in Europe, but in terms of transatlantic security architecture as well, which at the end of the day is directly connected to stability in a global security domain. And that's when Žygimantas mentioned that we have to understand also the impact of what is happening in Ukraine to what is happening and might happen in and around Taiwan in coming years. So this is why we have to consolidate our efforts today in order to make sure that Ukraine is on a winning path on a battlefield. And at the moment, we all follow very closely what's happening in multiple directions of Ukrainian counter-offensive. And hopefully they will make significant gains up to Vilnius summit in July. At least initially, they have been able to move on, but it's going to be very, very difficult. And secondly, we have to, in terms of endgame, we have to understand that this is crucially important for the NATO security, for NATO's future, that Ukraine will win. In their terms of definition of a win, we all know what President Zelensky and his team proposed in their 10-point peace plan. That includes also full liberation of Ukraine territory in terms of their international recognized borders of 1991, including liberation of Crimea. And this is something where we also have to understand that the time of gray zones, of sort of spheres of influence in Eastern Europe or in somewhere between East and West must be, left in the past, because we so many times have, recognize this, that if we do that, we just give a green light to aggressor to try our resolve. And perhaps another area where I'm a little bit worried about still is that if we think about defense expenditures, especially allies in Europe, then even having those dramatic news coming in from Ukraine, all in all, defense expenditures last year dropped in Europe by 11%. Yes, there are good and success stories, like countries on the eastern flank. Michael mentioned also these very crucial political decisions in Denmark. Finland, Sweden joining NATO, but at the same time, if we don't have yet the readiness to invest and invest heavily into defense domain, then we also give some sort of signal to Russia that we are not ready to accept the challenge what they are posed to us, and this is long game from Russian side, and we should not fool ourselves and believe that what we have seen so far in Ukraine, it's already meaning some sort of strategic defeat of Russia. Not yet, and we are far from that. And to achieve this strategic defeat of Russia, which is essential in terms of bringing peace back to Europe and stability, we have to be able today much more massively support Ukraine and our own defense capabilities and stocks.
Marco reminded one of the arguments we're using in this statement of 22 chairs. Well, as Marco said, Europe is still waking up on defense. You have some ceilings on defense, I heard, here in America. So we hear right that the most effective and less costly way for us to solve our security issues would be to get membership for Ukrainians. This is much less expensive than try to supply weapons without limit to Ukrainians, because you have a collective responsibility. Russians are so much afraid of our unity. They think that we are still leaving Ukrainians behind because we are not making that collective commitment. But when we do it, the war stops. And also another factor, with all those security guarantees, that's our guarantee, I think, on paper, to Ukraine, because it never worked. And the only guarantee I know is Article 5. But the problem is with the security guarantees, we will not get security from Ukraine. We are so much interested to have the security because they provide security in the region. They are capable to stop the enemy number one of NATO, like we name it in Madrid. Security guarantees will not provide security for us. And if not, we are next.
And sorry for speaking so much, but we are politicians, so we cannot stop ourselves. But you know, one of the things I would like to touch upon also is how necessary it is that we win in Ukraine, that Ukraine also gets be part of NATO, is also for the future, for the West. Because I don't think there could be a stabilization and peaceful West as long as we have Putin, at the anchor or the steering wheel in Moscow. And if Ukraine are getting, accepted into NATO, and if Russia have a strategic huge loss in Ukraine, he will probably also lose, something, so he will not be in power anymore. And that is also necessary for us, because I don't think we'll get a peaceful Europe as long as Mr. Putin is in power. I've been, focusing a lot on Russian internal politics for so many years. I'm very close to Vladimir Kurza, who just got, the 25-year sentence for saying just his mind. I spoke at Boris Nemtsov's funeral in Moscow back in 2015. So I have a lot of friends in Russia who is now either dead, in prison, or living underground. But who wants another Russia? Who wants a peaceful Russia in peaceful cooperation with Europe? And that's also, in our need as well. And therefore, we really need this strategic loss for Mr. Putin so he can be removed from power.
I just, perhaps to make a few points to put a bow on what we've discussed thus far. For one, I think it's remarkable that based on the best estimates of reputable international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, while some European defense spending is down, the Russian economy is going up, or at least will grow in the next year. I'm hopeful, and the administration has promised that in the coming years, Russia's military capability will be degraded because they won't have access to high technologies. But this is far from the threats issued before the full-scale invasion of the most awful, brutal sanctions in the history of mankind. And so at some point, Russia may very well reconstitute its military capabilities. And for that reason, building up a hard power deterrent, resetting the security architecture on Eastern Europe and those Bucharest 9 states of Eastern Europe, I think is hugely important. Secondly, I also would echo the comment that winning in Ukraine is cheaper than some sort of so-called frozen outcome, in large part because if Ukraine does not have access to the Black Sea, if the Russians aren't pushed back, it will be wholly dependent on Western aid in perpetuity. Regular transfer payments from wealthy countries like Denmark, Germany, the United States, the Baltic states are also already heavily involved, will far outpace whatever costs come along with supporting Ukraine to victory and a true security. Third, I would say on the security assurances and security guarantees, sitting here in Washington, security guarantees, I think, that are outside of the framework of NATO are probably a non-starter, because it requires Senate ratification, and senators will ask themselves, as should I think many Americans, why should the United States offer a guarantee that the rest of the alliance is unwilling to provide? And then if one says, well, there aren't guarantees, there are assurances, how did that work out after the Budapest Memorandum of 1994? So it's either NATO membership or don't expect the United States to pick up that which the rest of the alliance apparently is unwilling to do. And finally, I wish you all well in your mission, because the two comparisons that I've seen administration officials draw most recently in an excellent reported article in Politico by Nahal Tusi is between Israel, this meaning no security guarantee, but big outlays of funding to help Ukraine arm itself to the teeth so it can defend itself. And the second, most worryingly, is the ROK, Republic of Korea, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea parallel, meaning there's a frozen parallel somewhere in between, and parts of Ukraine are left to flourish while the other half is so-called behind a new Iron Curtain. And especially doesn't apply given the geography of Ukraine because of the Black Sea issue and Ukraine holding Russia holding Ukraine hostage. Odessa is Ukraine. Ukraine is Odessa. It needs to have freedom of action to be able to export and import. If we are looking at a long-term challenge with the Russians, and I believe this is a Russia problem, not just a Putin problem, we have to reset our militaries, as all of you have mentioned. Defense spending has already come up. One major choke point we've discovered here in the US, and it's not all that different for Europe, and I bemoan the fact that the Germans in particular have lost over a year Now there's, I think, an effective Minister of Defense in place, but is building out a defense industrial base, making sure that we have the capabilities to actually outfit that defense. How is that coming along in Europe? It's a torturous process here. It's difficult. There are procurement problems. We've been fighting a war on terrorism and so have a different type of military systems in place. But are we moving in the right direction? How do you feel? And Marco, we'll start with you and just move down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are moving in a right direction, and countries, including like my country, Estonia, are leading this process in terms of not only, again, talking and highlighting the issue or problem, but doing and procuring and investing and deciding about. Just to take about our initiative of procuring 1 million shells of 155 millimeter shells for Ukraine, and that was kind of interesting process. How did we end up with agreement among partners in European Union? Just to imagine 2 or 3 years ago that European Union will start provide military help in financial terms to somebody who is in direct conflict war with Russia was unthinkable. The same applies to the dependencies, energy dependencies of countries like Germany and so on and so forth. So we are in a process of kind of collective Zeitenwende in Europe, and it will take time. But we have to be much more bullish in terms of political readiness to decide about both investments, to tell to defense industries that these procurements are to stay for a long time, because the challenges not only in the East but on global level are not going to fade away. So as I said, I am positive, but that demands quite a lot of political efforts, both on national level, but also in NATO, and hopefully again Vilnius summit will allow to highlight the necessities of this kind of step.
And just continuing on this line, you know what's surprising? And I see here my good old friend Temur Yakobashvili, former ambassador, former minister. We all remember Bucharest. We were at Bucharest with him together. What is surprising, you remember Bucharest. We had Germans and French just blocking it. Today, we have Germans and French standing with us. We have Germans who are building as a key security partner in Lithuania. We are trying to get Germans involved and to have a physical brigade in Lithuania, because we are moving from this deterrence, defense by deterrence to defense by denial principle after what we saw in Bucha. We cannot wait for 1 or 2 weeks for NATO troops to land in Lithuania, because Vilnius will be just like Bucha. But my problem today, that we have all European capitals with us. German Social Democrats, German Christian Democrats, German Liberals, German Greens, Baltic, Nordic countries, UK. Tomorrow, Alicia Cairns, chairman of British committees, joining our last attempt to convince Washington before Vilnius NATO summit. We have the same in Italy, in Madrid, in Greece, because they understand that Russians are everywhere. Russians encirculated us. Russians are not only in Ukraine or Georgia. They're in Lebanon, they're in Sahel, they're everywhere. They're working with those autocratic regimes. My problem is that today, Washington does not lead on this issue. Because in Bucharest, that was quite a difference. President Bush was trying to build that coalition. Yes, I know it was difficult after Iraq. Yes, I know Europe was isolated and divided, but today they trust President Biden. And if President Biden today says this is the time to get, to start the path to Ukrainian membership, exactly like President Macron already said in Globsec, like Prime Minister Sunak already said in Moldova. So, President Biden, we heard great speeches, great inauguration speeches. We saw wonderful conferences on democracy. This is time to prove it by deeds, not by words, that you really defend democracy in Vilnius. And then we finalize this stuff in Washington, NATO summit. But, start marching the road to this.
And I'd note in this document you've circulated amongst your colleagues, thankfully both your colleagues here have signed it. It would be an awkward meeting otherwise. But your French and German colleagues are also counterparts, as I would add, Michael McCall, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who's been a stalwart ally of Ukraine. So at least there's some leadership in Washington. Please.
Well, thank you so much. And coming back to your question, it has been a difficult transformation of our military forces. Let's be also quite clear about that, because, we have not focused a lot on protection of the kingdom because we thought we were not threatened. So that's why we were very international oriented and participated in numerous conflicts around the world. But now the transformation is, up in high gear. And one of the things that, we tried to step up is actually one of the opt-outs we had regarding the European Union cooperation. We actually removed that last year in a referendum regarding the defense cooperation. Very big majority of the Danish population voted in favor of removing that opt-out. So we are now in complete cooperation. And that is one of the things that I think we can actually help each other. For example, with procurement, getting new arms, and so on. And one of the things that surprised me a lot is also how difficult, or how important it is to buy arms from countries that you have a good relationship with. It took too long with the Swiss government to actually get a yes to have our Piranhas, APCs, so we can supply them to Ukraine. But let's also be frank, it took too long to get the Biden administration yes to also get the possibility of supplying F-16s to Ukraine. We talked about this for over 6 months now, but we got the yes, so that's good. But we really need to also step up in that regard as well, and we are. And one of the good things about this, people talk for so many years that European Union is completely divided. We're not unified in anything regarding foreign affairs. We are unified in this. We're unified on this very, very important issue. Look at the sanctions. We are completely unified in European Union with some of the toughest sanctions the world have ever seen. So we are unified when something that this important is happening.
During the 2014 Wales Summit, there were 6 trust funds put in place on various issues to help Ukraine. 3 remain active, but one proposal, which again my colleague Luke Coffey in this paper I mentioned earlier raised, was create a Train Today for Tomorrow Trust Fund. Because one of the downsides of the, I think, rather timid and incremental approach of the Biden administration has been that a weapon system is green-lit, but in something as complex as the F-16, it then takes months for Ukrainians to train up. While the administration is deliberating, some would say hemming and hawing, they could already be training up, for example, the pilots. So the moment the decision is taken, they would be in action. And this would matter a great deal, for example, the current counteroffensive, where the Ukrainians have wonderful armor, and thanks in large part to the Kingdom of Denmark, but they lack the air support. Which takes me to a question that we've gotten online from an Estonian, so I'll actually pose it to you, Marco. And that is, the war has been mostly run from the West by the Ukraine Defense Contact Group operating out of Ramstein. So the NATO allies meet there. It's a 54-member coalition. But it has not actually been NATO itself as an umbrella organization active in the war. And so the question that I have here from one of your countrymen is, what NATO mission in Ukraine is still possible during or after a war, from medical to demining to equipment repairs? They raise even air defense, even if that might be a bridge too far for some. What do you say to that?
I would like personally to see a much bigger role of NATO as an alliance coordinating support, military help, and whatever missions needed as far as it is in reality today. Actually, NATO allies separately and under the umbrella, as I mentioned, Ramstein, have done a lot. And of course, Ramstein collects or kind of coordinates efforts not only of allies within NATO, but also from different other parts of the world. So it's I would also at the same time I'm a little bit worried. We have again a number of international organizations, and here's not only about NATO, but it's about Greenpeace, about United Nations. End of the day, after the ecocide, Russia is organized blowing up Kakhovka Dam and organizing this major ecological catastrophe in southern Ukraine. I haven't seen any sort of immediate, strong, massive reaction from those organizations in order to help Ukraine and Ukrainians. Again, it comes to the question, does this system really work? So
well, the UN had a tweet congratulating Russia Language Day, I think.
Exactly, you see it. But anyway, it's coming back to NATO question. I guess this is also about the question of leadership. We are in the right capital to ask about that. I assume that there has been kind of slow process of thinking what is the role of NATO as an alliance. Then Ukraine is in direct, brutal conflict and war with Russia. And I think we end up here understanding that we are not yet as allied force or NATO completely yet on the same page what kind of Russia policy we should have. And it also leads us to a question of possible escalation questions, and then the nuclear domain comes in, obviously. But I would like to see much more bolder sort of efforts by both strategists and politicians first and foremost, and in this town here as well. Because if we are not getting together on the same page here, we are still giving Russia some sort of edge and hope that they can maneuver out from a situation they have brought entire Europe or world in. And of course, one another area we didn't touch here, up in our parliament tomorrow will vote and adopt a resolution on calling international community very seriously to take steps to establish special tribunal in the format of UN General Assembly to bring those who committed the highest crime against peace, meaning crime of aggression, to justice.
Well, for the longest time, the Kingdom of Denmark had the distinguished reality of perhaps possessing the most strategic piece of real estate, the Bornholm Islands in NATO. With the Finns now in, there's the islands, which take on great importance and loom large. Helsinki itself is but a stone's throw from your national capital, a 25-minute flight, if such a thing even exists. And then, of course, Gotland Islands might be coming in soon, too, all of which I think raises questions about how Nordic defense is going to be changing in the coming months and years. The defense planning process at NATO is going to be changed dramatically, and getting everyone on the same page, to use a turn of phrase that you just employed, will be important. Can you all touch on that a little bit, on how this just fundamentally redoes kind of the defense of the Baltics and the contingency, please?
Well, it is a very important question, and right now we have negotiations in the Danish Parliament about, what kind of defense should we have, and the problem is, even though we have now going to reach the 2% threshold this year, it's still not enough to get a complete defense as necessary. And therefore, we also need to get a closer cooperation with our friends, for example, the Swedish friends, Norwegian friends, and also Finnish friends, about, where can we step in for each other. For example, we don't have any submarines at all, because, we scaled them down to nil, I think 10 years ago. So we don't have enough anti-submarine warfare capabilities. So should we buy new submarines, or should we perhaps get a closer cooperation with some of our friends that get submarines or have submarines? That is some of the discussions right now, because if we try to get a complete overview of everything, we will not be perfect in any field. So perhaps we can be perfect in some fields, and then our Swedish friends can be perfect in another field, and so on and so on. That's also one of the reasons why we changed our defense opt-out in the European Union. We need closer cooperation so we can work hand in hand on this.
Just maybe also last words in echoing my two friends and brothers on American leadership. Marco nailed it. We are in the capital where we should speak about the leadership. And to compare NATO and EU, I would say EU won the golden prize, because EU did what we are still asking NATO to do with candidate status decision. We agreed that Ukraine will be member. It might happen that this year under Spanish presidency we will start accession talks with Ukrainians. We are quite close to that. In NATO, we didn't even invite Ukrainians for membership. We are in this prehistoric age of Bucharest in NATO. So didn't America notice that something happens on our fronts? Do they really want to stay? I would say not even with Bucharest. Actually, Bucharest was inspired by Putin's Munich speech in 2007. So is America politically willing to stay at Bucharest level, to be scared by Putin, to think that NATO enlargement provokes the war? We know that non-NATO enlargement provokes the war. So it's time to Biden to return to Reagan, Truman, or I don't know, Bill Clinton doctrine, and do what his predecessors did and look to us. We resurfaced, we are happy, we are rich, we inspire all other nations. We really want to build the Europe whole and free, and sometimes in Washington, we feel more Americans than Americans themselves.
Coming back to the question about defense in the Nordics and the strategic situation, this is something we didn't believe can happen overnight. Even I remember in January last year, we had discussions about how long it might take for Sweden and Finland to reconsider the current situation. Then everybody understood that the major invasion is just is coming, and it's next door, and it was remarkable to see actually that both Finland and Sweden, led by social democrats, made this historic change, and of course the leadership of the people were really visible there. And now it's the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake. Soon, of course, I hope that Sweden will be in coming weeks full member of NATO, and we have to do whatever it takes. Actually, there is a real terms possibility that Black Sea will be as well NATO lake if Ukraine is free and liberated, and including Crimea, and one day Georgia also will reach the level of the readiness to become a full member of NATO. 86% of Ukrainians today ask NATO membership, are ready for that. And I guess the same level is present, perhaps a little bit less also in Georgia. But again, if our strategy is to protect our way of life, then what else is left just to formulate the strategy and work on that?
Well, it's unfortunate that you all came to us at the start of your visit, because after meeting with the Biden team, it's always nice to hear a little bit of a readout, and you can tell us secrets about what's going on in the U.S. government. But Marco Mikkelsen, Sigmantas Paviljonis, Mikael Astrup Jensen, it's been a real pleasure to have you here. Godspeed in your meetings, and we'll be watching very closely what takes place over the next month in the negotiations, and of course at the summit, just as we are watching the Ukrainians fight their way through Russian lines in their counteroffensive. Godspeed to them as well. Thanks all very much. Thank you for those of you watching at home at hudson.org, and thanks to those of you joining in from C-SPAN around the country. Thanks.